Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be returning to Order of Battle Pacific, the turn-based Panzer Corps kind of inspired war game which looks at the Pacific Theater and made by the Aristocrats, I believe is how you pronounce it. We've successfully invaded the Philippines, bombed Pearl Harbor, and also destroyed the Dutch fleet around the Java Sea, as well as taking the island of Java itself. And now we're moving on to the attempted conquest of New Guinea and Port Moresby, and in doing so we need to make sure that we reduce the American fleet in the waters around it. So that includes kind of an operation down the Solomon Islands, while we also attack Port Moresby at the tip of New Guinea. Now, you'll notice a few things that are a little bit different with this video compared to the previous ones. That's because when I upgraded my processor, I also got a new motherboard, and the way things work, I had to completely reinstall my operating system, and because I'm a genius, I didn't have any of my games backed up. None of my games were saved and backed up. Now, fortunately for the Commander Great Wars series, I had actually emailed the Lord's Studios team about an issue I was having prior to their last patch, so I actually had the most recent save still in hand for that game. So that series will still be able to continue. I actually recorded a video of the gameplay. I haven't done the audio voiceover, although we'll see how much longer that series goes. Regarding Order of Battle Pacific, I did not have the game saved, but I felt I was early enough in the campaign that I could go ahead and attempt to kind of replay it. So I did go ahead and I replayed it, same difficulty and all of that. The results were the same for the most part. Only a couple of things changed. I got one additional minor victory, which gave me that B-17 there on the bottom left. If you take Kijlap Airfield, or however you pronounce that, in the attack on Java, before the 25 turns are up, you get a B-17 that you capture and get to use in your core unit. And I also purchased a Bismarck class, or not Bismarck, good lord, we're not in the Atlantic, we're not the Germans. I also purchased a Yamato class battleship instead of the Nagato class, which I had purchased last playthrough. So I got a little bit better of a battleship, and I also got an additional heavy bomber, which won't be able to play any role in this game because you don't have anywhere to base your land-based bombers from. This represents the Battle of Coral Sea, which was the historic Japanese attempted invasion of Port Moresby. The idea was the Japanese were going to send a land invasion force by sea around into Port Moresby from the seaward end instead of the invasion down the New Guinea coast. And it was in conjunction with some landings down the Solomon Islands. The Japanese would send a carrier force to protect that landing force, and the Americans would attempt to stop them with their own carrier force. Historically, it was the first time that two fleets fought a major sea battle without seeing each other, without ever coming into visual range. It was fought strictly from the air. I suppose that differs from Pearl Harbor, which was a similar situation where neither fleet saw each other, where really it was an attack on a static position, because there certainly were cases where aircraft engaged naval vessels without each other seeing each other. But I suppose it was the first time that two fleets attacked each other and engaged each other in direct combat, where the Japanese took losses and the Americans took losses from an American attack and a Japanese attack, respectively, where neither fleet saw each other. So that's the significance of the Coral Sea. Now, historically, the battle is a bit of a mixed bag. The United States lost a fleet carrier. I think it was the Lexington. Yeah, it was definitely the Lexington. So in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. had the Lexington and the Yorktown deployed. The Yorktown was badly damaged, and the Lexington was sunk. The Japanese had a light carrier that was sunk, and I'm not even going to pronounce the name of the Japanese fleet carrier that was there. Starts with like an S-O something or other. But essentially, that carrier suffered some damage, but managed to escape. So essentially, the U.S. traded a light Japanese carrier for a heavy U.S. carrier, which at this time in the war was still early enough that was a critical blow to the U.S. By the end of the war, the U.S. had made something like 20-plus Essex-class carriers. A loss of a single fleet carrier wouldn't have been too detrimental, but at the time, the U.S. had, what did they have? They lost the Lexington here. They had the Saratoga. which would be sunk later in the war. And then they had the Yorktown, the Wasp, the Enterprise. I can't remember what else. The Hornet, I believe. They only had a couple of carriers. The Japanese fleet still heavily outnumbered the U.S., and the Japanese still maintained 6 fleet carriers afterwards, while the U.S. had fewer than that. Not to mention the Yorktown was badly damaged and her aircrews were badly damaged. So it was certainly a tactical victory, most likely from the Japanese, but from a strategic standpoint, the losses to aircraft caused the Japanese to not be able to adequately defend its invasion fleet, because their air force on their carriers was simply out of fighter aircraft to escort them. Interestingly enough, both the Japanese and the U.S. carrier fleets turned back after the battle, and as a result of U.S. land-based attacks on the landing group that was going to attack Port Moresby, the U.S. decided to, or the Japanese decided to withdraw the landing fleet. So it was really that first time that the unstoppable Japanese advance across the Pacific was blunted. It wasn't a decisive defeat. Again, the battlefield would kind of lend credence to the Japanese winning, but the strategic standpoint certainly went in the direction of the Americans. And it was the beginning of a shift. Just a month or two later, I think a month later, the U.S. would fight the decisive Battle of Midway, where everything would change in the Pacific, and from then on forward, the U.S. would always be on the offensive. So this is kind of that initial warning to the Japanese that things are starting to change in terms of the strategic landscape, and very shortly hereafter this battle, things would change quite dramatically. Now, in this scenario, what I'm doing is I'm sending out scout aircraft. I purchased a couple of additional ones because this is a gigantic map, and you'd really need to be able to spot where the enemy carriers are, because our fundamental goal is to clear Port Moresby with a surface fleet, which is why I deployed my Yamato with the light carrier off to the west. Hopefully the Yamato's big guns and the other cruisers in that direction can move forward and clear Port Moresby of any enemy surface vessels, while the carriers that I have here will move south. I also purchased a Tahoe-class carrier. That was a mistake. I didn't realize that the carrier only allows one aircraft to be put on that, so different types of carriers in this game have different capacity in terms of how many aircraft can land on it and be on it at any one time. Fleet carriers traditionally can have 3 units, which represents well the fact that at this time most fleet carriers had a fighter squadron, a dive bomber squadron, and a torpedo squadron. So that kind of represents that dichotomy of the real war at the time, that most carriers would have 3 air groups in them, while the light carriers can either have 2. I believe the Uho, or however you pronounce that, light carrier for the Japanese can have 2 aircraft groups on them, while the Tahoe can only have 1. So it's almost like a jeep carrier, like a fighter carrier. Anyway, I'm starting to move my carriers south with the intent of hopefully using those scouting aircraft to find the Americans and then hunt them down with my fleet. You can see here that we've now seen some American naval-based aircraft, those blue aircraft popping up toward Taguli, where Taguli, is that how you pronounce it? I can't remember. It's basically adjacent to Guadalcanal. But we can see here that the Americans are bringing in some carrier aircraft, which means we know they have carriers in the area. There's also a ripples from the past event, which basically reminds us that we sunk all the U.S. battleships at the attack on Pearl Harbor. Therefore, the U.S. is still shy those battleships. Those battleships would be in this scenario, or at least one of them would be in this scenario if we didn't have a decisive victory at Pearl Harbor. But as we did have a decisive victory at Pearl Harbor, we don't have to worry about any super heavy U.S. ships, although I'm sure that they have some cruisers available. Meanwhile, I'm kind of trying to position my fleet in a way that least endangers it from enemy torpedo attack. You know, if they can't get adjacent to me, hopefully that'll help in terms of protecting them from enemy air attack. Get them in a nice kind of line with their flanks shielded, limiting what the enemy can do in terms of torpedo attacks on us, while we continue to fly those scout planes to the south. Our light carrier force is shifting to the west toward the Port Moresby. Probably wise to keep our Shoho-class light carrier out of harm's way, not get it too close, but at the same time, I do want to be able to bring the air units in from that to perhaps bomb enemy ships in Port Moresby. So you can see here the U.S. is launching an attack on Tuguli Island with some dive bombers against our infantry there. You can see there's some scout aircraft. Now these units over here do not answer to us. They're not under our control. That's why on the mini-map on the bottom right-hand corner of the game, those units are in yellow because essentially we have no control over them. And you can see another enemy dive bomber attack, this one on the support ships near Tuguli. And we've also got some other enemy aircraft detected kind of approaching our carrier fleet, which one of our objectives is to keep our carrier fleet hidden from the enemy as long as possible. That's one of those kind of cat and mouse aspects of this game, especially for the carrier engagements. I will say the naval engagements sometimes in this game feel a little bit bland in that it just kind of seems like you're, I don't know what the best way or the kindest way is to put it, but it just kind of seems like you're, I can't even think of the right word. It just kind of seems ahistorical, maybe, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because there's a lot of games that abstract things. But the idea of the torpedo bombers is pretty nice in that you have to wait a certain number of turns before they can drop torpedoes again. So in some ways that simulates kind of limits on the staying power of your attacks. I think it would be an interesting decision if instead the game decided you only get to drop one bomb or one torpedo before you have to return to your carrier. I think that would probably more accurately and interestingly simulate carrier warfare, where when you launch your attack and how far out you launch it and all of those types of things and rearming and all of that matters a lot more. There's a little bit of that with the torpedo bombers just because you kind of have to basically just kind of let them sit around and do nothing for a few turns while they wait for their torpedo to come back. And you'd have to modify a few things. You know, you'd have to maybe say that bombs are more damaging than they currently are, or make torpedoes even more damaging, and also have a risk of just missing altogether. So I think that would be, or maybe not because it's a carrier, you know, a whole air group, but maybe have a much wider variety in kind of the damage. It's not just a set 2 or 3 based on the type of ship in the unit, but rather there's a missing factor and all of those other things. It'd make it a little bit more complicated, but it would more accurately simulate carrier combat, unlike the current method where basically as a dive bomber you can just sit around and keep dropping bombs on enemy ships essentially until you run out of fuel or until you're destroyed. So you could just kind of peck away at a destroyer for 10 turns, dealing 1 damage, 1 damage, 1 damage, 1 damage until eventually it sinks, which seems a little bit ahistorical. The naval combat has the same sort of flaw where destroyers can slowly take little pinpricks out of the enemy ships, but if you close in for torpedoes, then you can do substantial damage, especially if you get real close. I think we'll actually see that later in the scenario. So that aspect is a little bit, I think the surface combat would be more difficult to fix than the air combat. Still a lot of fun, still really enjoy it, but just kind of my thoughts on it. The one thing that really does bother me, though, is the fact that if you lose the scenario as the Japanese, and I know because this was my second attempt at the scenario, if you lose this scenario as the Japanese, you lose the entire campaign. And it does concern me a little bit because it feels like this is going to be almost the anti-Panzer Corps experience of a dynamic branching campaign. I think that was one of the things that really was appealing to both Panzer Corps and more specifically the original Panzer General, was this idea that if you fail your mission, you will actually influence your future battles. So if you lose, for example, there are some you can't lose. You can't lose Poland because, well, World War II wouldn't be World War II without Poland. I don't believe you can lose Norway. Well, you can avoid Norway if you only win a minor victory in Poland. So you might be able to lose Norway. But you can't lose the Low Countries because then, you know, if Germany doesn't invade France, the war becomes too different than it was historically. But there's a lot of variability in it. You know, if you can crush Moscow early and win the war in the East altogether, or if you only have minor successes there, you know, again, you can't lose that first scenario, but if you only have minor successes in Russia, then that influences the whole campaign going forward. And you can lose some battles. You can lose Kursk because Germany lost historically, or you can win it maybe and get another chance at Moscow. So there's a lot more variability there where your success or whatnot or failure influences future scenarios, where you can basically go down a ahistorical route where you invade the U.S., or you can go down a more historical route where you're slowly beaten back to Germany, even with limited successes in places until eventually you're defeated. And that kind of ability to recreate history or kind of go down a different path, while somewhat scripted, otherwise you'd have like 800 scenarios, while somewhat scripted, still feels more open than Order of Battle Pacific so far. I will say it's still early. We're only at Coral Sea, but the fact that I can't lose Coral Sea, it's not even like I can't lose a minor victory. If I succeed 2 of the 3 victory objectives, if I destroy the entire U.S. carrier fleet, which would be better than history, and if I don't lose a single carrier of my own and preserve my own carrier fleet, but I simply fail to clear the harbor of Port Moresby, then I lose the entire war, which to me seems a little bit odd for a battle that historically Japan didn't do as well as I did in that. I would say there's nothing wrong saying Japan can't lose both of their carriers, or even that's probably not fair, but there's nothing wrong with saying Japan can't, has to have some success at the Coral Sea. They can't just lose everything and do no damage. But there should be some kind of limit on how severe that is. You shouldn't have to win everything in a decisive manner in order to continue on, because that just doesn't simulate reality. You go on to the Battle of Midway, and there is a carryover effect in this scenario, where if you destroy all the U.S. carriers instead of just their airplanes, you get an added benefit at Midway, I believe. At least I assume that, because there's that secondary objective you can see there to destroy all the U.S. carriers. But I just don't understand that. A battle that Japan historically did not win should not force you to win the game to continue. It feels like I'm going to be forced to invade Australia and then invade the U.S., rather than going down a more historical route of, fighting on Guadalcanal against the U.S. The Guadalcanal campaigns are fascinating, and I hope it makes a really good scenario in this game. But it would be fun to play as the Japanese as well, because they really did have a good chance in some of the earlier stages of the campaign. There were a lot of really interesting naval battles which were fought out. There was an incredibly taxing war of attrition. A lot of people think of Midway as the breaking point for the Japanese Air Corps, and that they were never able to replace their losses. And while there is some truth to that, really, if you want to look at the real, I'd say, element where they lose a whole bunch of experienced pilots, it's that 10-month-long campaign in the Solomons, where there's just constant air combat going on between the islands, and you just the Japanese forces just lose plane after plane after plane. They inflict tons of casualties on the U.S. as well, but they're just slowly ground down in an intense war of these islands. And that's, I would say, where it would make an amazing scenario to kind of simulate the Guadalcanal campaign from the Japanese side as well. That would be absolutely fascinating, and maybe after the Battle of Midway that will happen. But it's still a little bit frustrating in that there doesn't seem to be much flexibility in this campaign for events outside of just Japan wins everything. And I could be wrong. I hope maybe I'm proven wrong. Maybe if I lose Midway or win a minor victory at Midway, we'll see that. The campaign continues. But that's one minor stumbling block. From the U.S., I would imagine there's some flexibility there, because at least for the first some odd many months, the U.S. lost pretty much everything. But I guess we'll see. I'm planning on probably doing a U.S. campaign as well once this wraps up. So, yeah, spoiler alert, I probably might win this battle if I'm showing you it, and I already told you that I lost one of them. But the other thing is the fact that the replayability is somewhat limited. I talked about how this game doesn't feel like a puzzle, where it's like, okay, you play the first time just so you win, figure out where things are, and then you play the second time around to min-max it. And I really don't feel like the land combat fits that model. The land combat feels a lot more dynamic. I think a big portion of that is the way that supplies play a big role in the combat model. But in the naval model, it's certainly, especially for the carrier action, that first time you play the scenario, it's a ton of fun, because it's cat and mouse. You're racing against the clock. You're trying to find the enemy carriers. You have no idea where they are. And just so, I'm not saying I know where they are. We're playing this scenario. I don't know exactly where the U.S. are. I know a general area, and this time I decided to purchase a couple extra scout planes to give me a better job, better time of finding it. So there's still a lot of cat and mouse where I send these scout planes, but in general, it feels much more puzzle-like in this type of a scenario in the naval combat, naval carrier combat, than I would say land combat feels. Land combat still feels much more interesting, and I'd be interested to see maybe a game that focuses more on land combat with the model that they have for this land combat. Not saying I want them to make a Panzer Corps 2 and use this game, and just move it to Europe, but I do think that the game would fit well to a land combat model. Maybe they'll look at the Korean War. No one ever seems to cover that war. Yeah, so those are just kind of my take on the battle, on the scenario, and on kind of the campaign structure here at this point in time. You can see here we're moving toward Port Moresby, and it's a good thing we sent the Yamato in, because we can see there's at least 2 enemy heavy cruisers, as well as a host of destroyers, so the Yamato should have no trouble cleaning those boys up, and our scout plane did its job in finding them, so we can more effectively engage them. You can see we did fail the objective of keeping our carriers out of sight of the enemy for at least 10 turns, which means the enemy carriers are going to be able to launch attacks against us more quickly, which means that we may have to keep some of our fighter aircraft back as kind of a combat air patrol to protect against enemy air attacks. Yeah, there's the other ahistorical aspect of in a air combat situation. Because of the way the game plays out, you very well could get stuck in a situation where you leave all of your fighters and send them with your attack planes, then you see the enemy coming in and you recall your fighters. That's just not something you could do in World War II. And again, I'm not someone who's saying the game has to be historical in every way. I'm perfectly fine with rather large degrees of abstraction, but I do wish there was a little bit more dynamism, at least based on what I'm seeing so far, to the campaign game. But again, it's still early, at least I think it's early. I don't know how many scenarios are in this campaign if we continue, but it is still 1942, so I would think it is still early as we fight through May, and I would imagine the Battle of Midway will be the next scenario, as that took place in June. Interestingly enough, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a battle which really set the stage for the Battle of Midway. I mentioned the Japanese having 6 fleet carriers. It might have been 7. It was 6 or 7 fleet carriers available to their Navy at the time, where the U.S. had fewer than that. I think they had about 4 operational, and they'd lose 1 here, so they'd only have 3 left. They'd then lose Yorktown at Midway, so they'd only have 2 after that, and then they'd lose another at the Santa Clara Islands, I believe is the name of the battle, in the South Pacific as part of the Solomons campaign, where then the only active U.S. fleet carrier in the Pacific would actually be the Enterprise for a short while. But anyways, I was saying the Battle of Coral Sea was also important, not just because of the fact that it was the first time that 2 carrier fleets engaged each other without seeing each other, not just because the Japanese lost a light carrier and their invasion force was turned back, but also because the Japanese had 2 other fleet carriers in the area, and while neither one of them was sunk, one was damaged, and another's air complement was so badly devastated that when it came to the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese deployed almost their entire navy to the Midway operation to destroy 3 U.S. carriers, 2 Japanese fleet carriers, which normally would have a complement between the 2 of over 100 additional aircraft, were held back from the operation because they simply didn't have enough crews. The Sokawaka, or however you pronounce that name, I said I wouldn't earlier, but I attempted it there, ended up being too damaged in order to participate, and the other Japanese fleet carrier ended up losing so many planes it only had something like 30 operational aircraft and had to retrain its new crews. Imagine if the Battle of Midway unfolds and the Japanese have 6 fleet carriers to choose from rather than just the 4. The U.S. was already outnumbered, but imagine an additional 100 aircraft. The Japanese having an additional 20 fighter aircraft could have made all the difference in the successful dive bomber attacks on the fleet. The entire Japanese fighter force might not have been drawn down to engage the U.S. torpedo bombers, which came in first, and then been ill-positioned to deal with the dive bombers coming in high while the Japanese screen was low. That played a key factor in the U.S.'s success in the Battle of Midway. Another thing to consider is the fact that, if the Japanese had 2 additional carriers, maybe instead of rearming the entire strike force for a second attack on Midway, maybe the Japanese decide to have 2 carriers ready for a naval strike and 2 carriers ready for a airstrike. Maybe that prevents the U.S. Fleet from having as successful and devastating an attack on the Japanese, because there's 2 more carriers to target, and those carriers may not have bombs on their decks, and then that dilutes the attack on the rest of the carriers, perhaps. So there's a lot of what-ifs that I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about in the Midway campaign, but that's another important factor in the Battle of Midway was the long-term ramifications for the Japanese of having two of their finest fleet carriers held out of the Battle of Midway, which would take place just a month later. Interestingly enough, the USS Yorktown, which was another fleet carrier which partook in the Battle of Coral Sea and suffered heavy damage, although it was not sunk, contrary to what the Japanese thought, USS Yorktown was actually quickly repaired. So unlike the Japanese, who lost a huge number of air crews and also had damage that they couldn't repair in time for the operation, the U.S., owing somewhat to the proximity of Midway being much closer to their headquarters, maybe allowed for a quicker turnaround. They could stay in port and wait for the Japanese to show up and repair that entire time, whereas the Japanese would have had to send their carrier out at the very start of the operation, which they did not do. So another interesting aspect is the fact that both sides suffered heavy damage on some of their fleet carriers at Coral Sea, but the U.S. was able to quickly turn that damage around and get its carrier back to sea, and that additional third U.S. carrier would play a big role in the success of the Battle of Midway. But again, we're getting a little bit too much into Midway and getting away from Coral Sea. You can see here the Japanese, or the U.S., have scout planes which are kind of shadowing our fleet here. Meanwhile, we're still waiting. I guess we'll go ahead and start deploying our Air Force for an attack against U.S. carriers. We haven't specifically spotted them, but we've spotted a good degree of their screen and some of their cruisers, which tells us that we know they're in the general vicinity, so we can start getting some of our aircraft up into the air and ready for an engagement here as the U.S. Sends in some fighters against our scout planes and severely damages them. You can see there's a support ship there. I believe that's to represent the U.S. fleet carrier's oiler. The U.S. had an oiler moving with the fleet to extend the range of the force that would actually be sunk by the Japanese at the Battle of Coral Sea, which would also play a factor in the U.S. carrier fleet deciding to withdraw after the grievous losses of the air engagements. But anyway, that's kind of the situation that we have right now. You can see our surface fleet is moving into the Port Moresby area and starting to inflict some casualties on the enemy. Meanwhile, with the increased number of enemy aircraft, our scout planes are definitely getting close to the enemy fleet carriers. We have to be very close indeed to where the enemy carriers might be. Hopefully these enemy fighter aircraft do not delay our spotting the enemy because they're shooting us all down. But there we have it. You know, the Battle of Port Moresby itself looks like it's going to be a success. We've sunk the bulk of the enemy destroyers. We'll probably finish the last one off here, and then we'll have 3 heavy cruisers, which our own 2 heavy cruisers and 1 battleship should have no problem dealing with. And then what we'll do is we'll move our destroyers in for some torpedo attacks here. You can see we choose a torpedo attack, and when you get really close in, like when you get 1 hex away, directly adjacent, torpedo attacks from destroyers on capital ships can actually be pretty devastating. You can see there we just took out 8 of the enemy's hit points there with torpedo attacks. Meanwhile, even launched torpedoes from our cruisers, which the Japanese were famous for as well. Being able to do that. So you can see here we're reducing this Australian cruiser. I'm not sure why it's a USS New Orleans class when it's an Australian ship, but anyway, that is, I guess, odd. And we're moving our fleet in to finish the enemy fleet off near Port Moresby. Meanwhile, we're continuing to scout for the enemy aircraft carriers. Like I said, we must be very close. And we've started launching our strike force because essentially one thing to keep in mind in this game is carriers can only launch 1 aircraft per turn. So if you've got a carrier that has 3 aircraft slots, you've got a fleet carrier that has 3 aircraft slots on board, you can't just launch all 3 in 1 turn and get them all on target. You can only launch 1 per turn. So it does take a little bit of time to form up an attack, which is kind of cool. In most games, you don't see that kind of delay between getting aircraft airborne and forming up for an attack. I suppose you could send them all in piecemeal, but that wouldn't be all that interesting to me to send them in piecemeal. Certainly wouldn't be accurate. But yeah, like I said, you can only launch 1 per turn, and you can see we're forming up for an attack on the enemy carriers, although we don't know exactly where they are yet. I hope this video sounds okay. I'm not actually recording from home. I am using my microphone, but it's in a very different setup in a very large room, a very large living room, so the sound may be a little bit different. And I hope it sounds okay. Let me know what you guys think in the comments and descriptions and all of that. I've been a little bit lazy. I wouldn't say lazy, that's the wrong word. But I've been a little bit lackadaisical, still a wrong word. I have not been as prodigious in turning out videos lately. I've had a lot going on. I'm definitely doing a lot of work with the Scourge of War team, doing a lot of testing and whatnot for the game, which just came out. In addition to that, I've got some personal things going on as well that are just not giving me a lot of time. Just accepted a new job that starts next month as well, which unfortunately will probably involve about an hour-long commute. It's a really good opportunity, but it will limit how frequently I can make these videos. But still, something I enjoy, not going to go away, just basically saying that I've had some things going on, some personal things that have been limiting how many videos I've been able to put out, how quickly. Still hope that this is up to the standards that you guys expect. I never quite feel that I meet my own standards, so it's one of those things that's always a little bit frustrating for me when I feel like I could be doing so much more, but just don't have the time or energy to do what I would like to do. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. Wow. Neither here nor there. You know, didn't start this video for excuses, certainly. So I think that's going to about wrap it up for this video. You can see here we're about to win in Port Moresby. I think I've said that like 3 times now, as the enemy is slowly being whittled down there. Meanwhile, our carrier fleet has finally gotten its aircraft strike group in line and ready to move south to where the enemy carriers surely are. Again, I don't know for sure where they are, but I do know enough to know that you know, they're going to be in a general area where all these support ships and cruisers that I've spotted are, so that they shouldn't be too difficult to spot once we get those aircraft down there. They'll also provide a bigger scouting wing, so narrow down some of those areas. And I've got several scout aircraft kind of converging in the few areas that I haven't seen yet. So the enemy will definitely be spotted soon. There you can see we finished off the Battle of Port Moresby by destroying those surface vessels, and now we just need to find the enemy carriers and destroy them before our time runs out, because as I said, you have to complete every major objective in order to win a battle in this game. So there we are. There we have it. I guess, like I said, that's going to go ahead and end this video. I really do appreciate you guys tuning in. Let me know what you think. I hope this wasn't a poor quality video, but if it was, let me know what was wrong with it. Hope everything sounds okay, because again, not recording from my normal location. And until next time, you guys, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching. I really do mean that. Thank you quite a bit. And until next time, I'm out.